I'm very pleased to be talking to Elena Mason today about her new book, Feminist Philosophy, An Introduction. Let me just first introduce Ellie. She is Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's a recent arrival at UCSB, having spent most of her career so far at Edinburgh University, where in fact she was teaching, I think, when we first discussed this book some years ago. She's also held visiting positions at Dartmouth College and University of Colorado Boulder. And before Edinburgh was assistant professor at CU Boulder, and before that, assistant professor at Arizona State. Ellie works mainly on feminism, moral responsibility, and the general area of ethics and moral philosophy. Her book, Ways to be Blameworthy, Rightness, Wrongness and Responsibility, was published by Oxford University Press. And her next book, as I mentioned at the beginning, which we'll be talking about today, is called Feminist Philosophy, An Introduction, and will be published by Routledge on July the 30th.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased that this book is coming out finally. As you say, it's been a project that has been several years in the making, but it's done now, and I'm excited to see it finally happening.
To begin with, Ellie, I just had a few sort of general questions about the book. The first one really is, why did you write it in the first place?
Well, I started teaching feminist philosophy when I went to Edinburgh. And I didn't know really anything about feminist philosophy at that point. I was asked to teach it because Ray Langton had recently left, and I took over her course. And I think the only reason they asked me basically is because I was a woman, which is perhaps some qualification, but not much. And so I had to kind of do it from scratch. And at that point, feminist philosophy was a bit of an outlier, I think it's fair to say, in analytic philosophy. And I had to pull together a lot of different material and think about where it sat in the context of the tradition that I was coming from and working in. And it was tough to do that. Since then, there has been a lot more work, and particularly in analytic philosophy, things have really changed. There's been a lot more work, a lot more interest, a lot more departments are teaching feminist philosophy. And so I wanted to write the book that I would and do want to use for teaching. So I've learned so much from my students about what they're interested in and what they need. And I've talked to a lot of other people who are teaching feminist philosophy, some of them like me for the first time. And I think that this book will help, both students and faculty to get a grip on the general lay of the land. So one thing that I think is worth stressing is that I don't think that feminist philosophy is a methodology. I think that it's just a subject matter. So it's just philosophy, and I'm inclined to be pretty broad-minded about what philosophy is. But it's just philosophy applied to moral and political issues that affect women in particular. So it's really about sexism and oppression and about understanding those things. And doing that in the way that philosophers do things, trying to understand the concepts, trying to get clear on what's going on. So this isn't a book that sort of sets out a new methodology at all. I'm rather looking at all the different kinds of work that have gone on in different areas that are relevant to the oppression of women, sexist oppression, and providing a kind of overview there.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. One of the things we discussed, I think, quite a lot when you were in the early stages of writing was how we should divide the book up internally. And in the end, you thought the best way of doing it was to have the concepts part of the book in the second half, but actually in the first part of the book to actually really cover some, if you like, some applied or real problems that a characteristic of debates in and around feminism. And it'd be very helpful, I think, for people to hear, why did you decide to structure it that way, to have the concepts, the sort of, if you like, the philosophical reflection or analysis or inquiry in the second half?
Well, the feedback that I got from students was the thing we really want to know about first is what to say, what to think about these problems. Like, what should, I'm a feminist, I'm 18 years old. I don't know much about it. But what should I think about these things like pornography and sex work? I'm getting all these mixed messages from the world around me. Should I be a sex positive feminist? What's that? What does that mean? Should I think pornography is bad? And so these are the questions that really animate students, that they really find interesting and urgent. I think the feedback I got from my colleagues is, oh no, we need the concepts first. We need the theoretical material first. And I can see that there are different approaches possible. And so it's actually flexible. The book is designed so that each chapter can be read on its own. So if you were teaching a course, you could choose, well, I'm going to do 10 of these topics, and you can choose which ones to do. And you can do them in whatever order you want. And in fact, that's what I do when I'm teaching myself. So I start with some of the practical issues, but then I dot back and forth between doing a little bit more work on things like what is oppression or what is intersectionality. And then I jump back and do more of the practical issues. So yeah, it's really flexible how you teach with this book or how you learn with it. And yeah, I think people have different learning styles.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's really interesting. My next question is something that I think is really interesting, and that we discussed when you were writing the book, and indeed while you were putting the finishing touches to the book. We were in the middle of the pandemic, and there's a very interesting thing you say, I think, in chapter 3, when this is to quote you briefly on it: we do not have very good reasons to think that there are innate differences between men and women, or that women are not fitted for intellectual or high-powered jobs and men are not fitted for caring responsibilities. And one of the things I think that we had talked about a bit earlier was to what extent the pandemic and a state of lockdown has kind of highlighted this area. What do you think? What's your view about this?
Well, I think that we have these very entrenched views about gender and about innate gender differences, and they're really resilient. So we have this idea that there just must be deep psychological differences between men and women. And as I say in the book, and I cite Cordelia Fine, among other people, that the science here really doesn't show us that there are these innate differences. And so I think we ought to be really open-minded about it. But as I say, we don't have much evidence for thinking that there are deep differences. And even if there were, of course, that's not a reason for treating people differently. But I think the fact that all these things seem to have re-entrenched during the pandemic is, so the fact that women are more likely to lose their jobs, they're more likely to be in precarious employment, they're doing more of the childcare, more of the domestic work. And of course, the rates of domestic violence have been increasing frighteningly, and we don't even know exactly what's going on. So the fact that women are being dangerously, in some cases, confined to the domestic sphere, and that their engagement in the professional world is being limited because of lockdown, because of the pandemic, I think that illustrates just how deep this kind of ideology goes, that as soon as there's some kind of emergency, some kind of danger, it's like, right, back into traditional gender roles. So the escape from traditional gender roles, the progress in moving away from that is fragile. And that it seems that kind of the patriarchal power structures can't risk it as soon as things go wrong. So of course, that's all speculation. But I think that makes sense of what we're seeing.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's a really interesting link actually to my next question, which has two parts to it. I think one of the aspects of your book that certainly struck me very strongly, and I think is a real strength, is that the study of feminist philosophy, as you approach it, is the study of structures of oppression caused by patriarchy, and the term patriarchy crops up a great deal in the book. And so I've got just two questions related to this. And the first one is, does it mean that, should we understand oppression as the result of certain institutions and power structures? So, for example, corporations, the state, the family, law, and religion, and so on, or is it actually that oppression's the consequence of ideologies and beliefs held at a personal or individual level, and that ending oppression and indeed sexism is about belief change on the part of individuals? And in fact, you discuss, I think, a little bit in the book some of the debates around bias and prejudice. I just wondered what you thought of that. So on the one hand, there's this sort of there's the idea of oppression being the result of structures, and on the other hand, oppression being the result of actual beliefs sort of held individually, if you like. Shiv, that question sort of something I felt sort of comes through the book very strongly is the structural element, but at the same time, you're a philosopher, and philosophy is about the holding of certain beliefs, and just sort of how you see those two questions as connecting or not.
So, yeah, good question. I think primarily the issue is structure. But what we have going on in what I call a patriarchal society, and by that I don't mean anything terribly precise. I mean a society that is structured so as to generally favor men for power. So, as a society that has gender rules, where the gender rules are enforced in formal and informal ways, and the man gender is given the power. I think it's worth saying as well that I don't think that men get nothing but benefit. I think, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, men suffer a lot because of patriarchy too. The thing they get isn't happiness or comfort. The thing they get is power, responsibility, and authority. So I think that, yes, it's chiefly structure, in that it's kind of baked into the way that we do things. So sexism is a structural issue. It's the way that our society is organized around giving power to men and a division of labor, so that the kind of work that women do is not the kind that moves the plot along. It's not the kind that involves authority, power, and responsibility. But I do think individual belief is a big deal. So in two ways. First, part of the way that our society is organized in a patriarchal way is through what philosophers call ideology. So it's not just that we have a set of institutions like the law and the family, it's that we have a set of beliefs, and those feed into and support, and of course are supported by the institutions. So we have ideologies about the family. So people think, all families need a mother and a father. That's a piece of ideology, a very powerful piece of ideology, and you can see how it drives policy and it drives sort of social organization. And people buy into it. I mean, people believe it. So it's self-supporting. So I think that we do need to think about people's beliefs. And part of changing patriarchal structures is getting people to see that they're not necessary and natural. That what we think is normal, what we think is natural, what we notice and what we don't notice, all of these things are affected by the kind of ideologies that we've internalized. So it's not a question of individuals having sexist beliefs. That's not that's not the main thing that philosophers are interested in, and I don't think it's the main thing that any feminist is interested in. We're interested in these sort of bigger deals.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. That's interesting. That relates to the second part of my question, which is that you discuss in the chapter on sexism and oppression, which I think is chapter 6, that there are some philosophers and feminist theorists who've argued that whilst men are not oppressed, they are often harmed by patriarchy. I think that's quite an interesting claim, and I wondered what you make of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So patriarchy involves these strict rules for gender, and men have to be a certain way. They have to obey the rules of masculinity. And what Marilyn Fry points out is that it's different for men in that they're not in a double bind. If men do obey the rules of masculinity, then they do get reward. The problem with femininity, the rules of femininity, is that women are in this double bind, which is that if you obey the rules, if you're kind of nice and submissive, you don't get rewarded. But if you disobey, you get punished. So going back to masculinity, the problem is that even for men who manage to obey the masculinity rules, they manage to be all tough and they don't cry and they're, the ruler of the family or whatever the particular masculinity rules in their society are. There's often a lot missing from the human ideal, from potential. So, for example, parenthood. I think that in our society, men are in some ways forbidden from fully partaking in fatherhood. And of course, that's a huge loss and a huge cost. It's not inconsistent with saying that it's a patriarchal society. It's just that patriarchy is terrible for everybody.
Yes, yes. Thank you. That's really interesting. And just a couple more questions before we finish up. One of the things I think you do a terrific job of in the manuscript is distilling a huge mass of scholarly material by philosophers and feminist theorists who've written about feminism. I mean, just on the chapter on objectification, for example, you sift through the arguments of Simone de Beauvoir, Nancy Bauer, Martha Nussbaum, Ray Langton. I had to make a list. Anne Eaton on the objectification in art and how that weighs in on debates about the male gaze. But my question actually is how do we then take this incredibly interesting and erudite sort of knowledge about different conceptual issues and problems around feminism? How do we bring that out into the real world and bring about change? And maybe another way of phrasing the question is, I mean, what advice would you give to the student of feminist philosophy about how to sort of manage how to read that scholarly work, but at the same time think about feminism itself and feminist philosophy for themselves?
Yeah, so this is the question my students always ask me at some point in the course. They say, okay, this is all really interesting, but what do we do? How do we change things? And yeah, I'm afraid I have to say that's so difficult. I don't have an answer. So this is the first step. The first step is understanding things. And I do think that's a huge step. I'm thinking about myself growing up in a world surrounded by images that objectify women. It seems to me now, I can't believe it wasn't obvious to me then, but it wasn't. I kind of took these things for granted. Um, and I think that just beginning to see them and then having a framework to talk about why it's a problem and being able to talk to other people about it, that's at least a first step. As to what we should actually do in the kind of broader political realm, well, there's lots of people writing about that, and there are lots of people thinking about that. And so I guess my advice is, okay, go take the philosophy as the foundation and feed it in to people who are thinking more about action and what we ought to do.
Thanks. Yes. Well, that's very interesting. I think that's a very good philosopher's answer. I'm very pleased to hear that as well. And my final question, Ellen, I think the one in a way that was at the top of my list, but I moved right to the end. It's one I've been wanting to ask you is, given that this is a book about feminist philosophy written by women, why do you think women remain so poorly represented in the profession itself? I mean, recent figures, I think, suggest that men account for about 70% of the profession in the UK and perhaps as high as 80% in the US. And this is despite arguably big efforts by the profession to address this imbalance. Why do you think it exists, and is philosophy actually underpinned by a patriarchal culture?
Well, I think everything's underpinned by a patriarchal culture. So, yeah, I do think that all the things I just said about gender ideology and division of labor and the domestic sphere apply here, that we have these ideas about what men and women are like. And one of the main ideas that we have that's very resilient is that men are more rational. And so philosophy, which is about thinking rationally, seems to be this paradigmatically male thing. And I think not many people would admit to thinking that, but I think it is kind of drifting around. So there is lots of empirical research about this. Uh, so, for example, there's research about how we perceive traits in men and women. We perceive men as having agentic traits, and we perceive women as having communal traits. Um, Philosophy is also one of the disciplines, like maths and science, where we have this idea that to be a philosopher is to be a genius. So a philosopher is someone who's got this, like, they just get it. They're just like a big hitter. I've heard that expression a lot. This guy's a big hitter, or this person's just a powerhouse, and that's that kind of way of thinking about it tends to correlate with a high number of men in the profession. So I think that's definitely part of what's going on. And I think that there are all kinds of subtle and unsubtle ways that that plays out in the profession. And it's worth saying, though, that the biggest drop off of women is at the undergraduate level. So it's after the women undergraduate students take their first course in philosophy, they decide it's not for me. So Cheshire Calhoun has a great article about this, which I talk about in the book, of how it just seems like it's this male-coded thing, and it really is this deep thing. So it's, in other words, I think that there are barriers in the profession. So I think, for example, the fact that in America there's this tenure system, and this applies to all academia, not just philosophy, but the tenure system is very tough because the years when you don't have tenure are, for many women, the years when you might be pregnant, breastfeeding, looking at children. That's a really tough structural barrier. But I think that the issues in philosophy go deeper. I think that the fact that undergraduates are put off it so early, and so that's why I think I often have this experience of teaching feminist philosophy and having women come up to me and say, "This is amazing. This is the first time I've been taught by a woman. It's the first time we've been taught about women. This is the first time anybody's ever mentioned sexism. This is fantastic. It's a different thing." So that's, I think, one of the things that's been most rewarding about teaching feminist philosophy these years is getting through to people and getting them interested in philosophy when they might otherwise have given up.
Well, thank you, Ali. That's extremely interesting conversation, and thank you for your time and your engaging responses. Really great. Thank you very much. And just a reminder that Ellie's book is called Feminist Philosophy: An Introduction, and is published on the 30th of July by Routledge.